Churchill, Walking with Destiny, by Andrew Roberts. Introduction. Have you ever had a feeling, deep down, a quiet certainty about what you were meant to do with your life? A conviction so strong that it felt less like an ambition and more like a destiny? Imagine a boy, not much younger than you are now. He's 16 years old, walking with a friend on a quiet Sunday evening. He isn't the best student. His father, a famous politician, thinks he's a disappointment, not clever enough for a career in law or government. But on this evening, this boy turns to his friend and says something extraordinary. He says that one day, terrible wars will come, wars unlike any the world has ever seen. London, the heart of the British Empire, will be in mortal danger. And, he adds, he will be the one to save it. What do you make of a statement like that? Is it youthful arrogance? A wild fantasy? Or is it something more? Is it possible that some people just know? Today, we're going to explore the life of that boy, Winston Churchill, through the eyes of one of his most brilliant modern biographers, Andrew Roberts. The book is called Churchill, Walking with Destiny, and it's a masterpiece. It's sold hundreds of thousands of copies around the world and has been hailed as the single best biography of the man ever written. Its author, Andrew Roberts, is a historian who has spent decades immersed in the private papers and personal letters of the people who shaped our world. He doesn't just tell you what happened, he takes you inside the room where it happened. And the story he tells is about more than just history. It's about preparation. It's about how a life filled with failures, with ridicule, with years spent in total political isolation, could be the perfect training ground for the greatest trial humanity has ever faced. Churchill himself, on the night he became Prime Minister in May 1940, as Hitler's armies were storming across Europe, wrote that he felt as if I were walking with destiny, and that all my past life had been but a preparation for this hour and for this trial. So, what was that preparation? How does a lonely, unloved little boy, the product of what he himself called an unhappy childhood, become the man who could stand alone against the darkest tyranny the world has ever known? And what secrets can his journey reveal to you, as you stand on the threshold of your own life? That's our bold promise for today. Stick with me, and by the end of our time together, you will understand the hidden architecture of a great life, and perhaps, you'll see the path to your own destiny a little more clearly. Book summary. Our story begins not with a great man, but with a small boy. A boy born into a world of immense privilege, yet who felt like an outsider in his own home. Winston Leonard Spencer Churchill entered the world on November 30, 1874, in a small room in Blenheim Palace, a colossal building that was more a monument to victory than a home. His ancestry was a potent mix: on one side, the English aristocracy, the Dukes of Marlborough, the very fabric of the British establishment; on the other, the daring, gambling spirit of America, through his beautiful and vivacious mother, Jenny Jerome. You could say he was half English aristocrat, half American gambler, a combination that would define his entire life. His father, Lord Randolph Churchill, was a brilliant, erratic political star, a man who seemed destined to be Prime Minister but whose career flamed out in a spectacular act of self-destruction. His mother was a celebrated beauty who shone in London society like a rare jewel. They were famous, they were captivating, and they were almost entirely absent from their son's life. Winston later wrote of his mother, "She shone for me like the evening star. I loved her dearly, but at a distance." As for his father, he would later confess that the total time they spent in continuous conversation throughout their lives was less than a few hours. So, the young Winston was raised by a nanny, a kind woman named Mrs. Everest, who became his confidant and the sole source of the unconditional love he craved. It was to her that he poured out his troubles from the grim boarding schools he was sent to, places where he was consistently described as naughty and troublesome. This wasn't because he was a dull student. His reports show flashes of brilliance, especially in history and English. No, his rebellion was a cry for attention, a refusal to be the unseen, unheard child that the Victorian era demanded. From this lonely childhood, two powerful forces emerged in him. The first was an unshakable belief in himself, a certainty in his own destiny that was almost mystical. He knew his family names, Spencer and Churchill, had been at the center of Britain's story for centuries, and he felt he was born to play a leading role. The second was a desperate need to prove his worth to the father who barely acknowledged him. He decided that the only path open to a boy who wasn't considered clever enough for the law was the army. But for Winston, the army was never going to be a career. It was a stepping stone. It was a theater where he could perform acts of courage, win medals, and make a name for himself. He once told a friend his plan: the army, of course, so long as there's any fighting to be had. When that's over, I shall have a shot at politics. And so, at the age of 20, this young officer, with little money but a famous name, set out to find a war. Any war would do. His search for action took him to the far corners of the world. First, to Cuba, where he came under fire for the first time while observing the rebellion against the Spanish. Then to India, where, stationed with his regiment, the 4th Hussars, he began a ferocious program of self-education. He felt the gaps left by his formal schooling and devoured the great works of history and philosophy: Gibbon, Macaulay, Plato, Darwin. He was forging in his own mind the intellectual weapons he knew he would need later in life. But books weren't enough. He craved action. On the northwest frontier of India, he joined the Malakand field force, fighting against the fierce Pashtun tribesmen. He acted as both a soldier and a war correspondent for a London newspaper, a dual role that was highly unusual and looked on with suspicion by the military establishment. He deliberately rode a conspicuous gray pony along the skirmish lines, a gesture of almost suicidal bravado. "I play for high stakes," he wrote to his mother, "and given an audience there is nothing too daring or too noble." He was learning a fundamental lesson about his own nature. He was an actor who needed a stage. His next stage was even grander: the Sudan. In 1898, a British-Egyptian army under General Kitchener marched south to reconquer the Sudan from the fanatical dervish warriors. Churchill pulled every string he could to get a place in the expedition, and finally managed to get himself attached to the 21st Lancers. The campaign culminated in the Battle of Omdurman, a brutal, one-sided affair where modern machine guns and artillery mowed down the spear-wielding dervishes. But Omdurman is remembered for one thing above all: the last great cavalry charge in British history. Churchill was there. As the 21st Lancers charged what they thought was a small group of enemy riflemen, they suddenly found themselves confronted by thousands of dervish warriors hidden in a dry riverbed. It was a death trap. Churchill, armed not with a saber but with a modern Mauser automatic pistol, a lucky consequence of a dislocated shoulder that made it hard to wield a sword, found himself in the heart of the melee. "I found myself surrounded by what seemed to be dozens of men," he wrote. He shot his way out, killing at least 4 men at point-blank range. In those 2 frantic minutes, a quarter of the charging Lancers were killed or wounded. Churchill had not only survived, he had another thrilling story to tell. But the most defining adventure of his youth was yet to come. With the outbreak of the Boer War in South Africa in 1899, he rushed to the front, this time as the best-paid war correspondent in the world. He was aboard an armored train on a reconnaissance mission when it was ambushed and derailed by Boer commandos. Under heavy fire, Churchill, a civilian, took command, rallying the soldiers to clear the tracks and get the engine away with the wounded. He himself stayed behind and was captured. His imprisonment in Pretoria could have been the end of his adventure. For a man so hungry for action, the prospect of sitting out the war as a prisoner was a form of living death. So he planned his escape. On the night of December 12, 1899, he scaled the prison wall and simply walked out into the streets of the enemy's capital. With a price on his head, he traveled 300 miles across hostile territory, hiding in a coal mine and sneaking aboard freight trains, until he finally reached neutral territory. His escape made him an international hero. He was no longer just Lord Randolph's son. He was Winston Churchill, the man who had escaped from the Boers. He returned to Britain a celebrity and was elected to Parliament in the election of 1900, finally entering the political arena he had so long prepared for. He was 25 years old. Now, you might think that having achieved his goal, he would settle in as a loyal member of the Conservative Party. But Churchill was never one to follow the expected path. He quickly grew disillusioned with his party's direction. He saw it as stodgy, unimaginative, and resistant to the kind of social reforms he believed were necessary. His father had championed an idea called Tory democracy, a belief that the ruling class had a duty to improve the lives of ordinary working people. Winston inherited this conviction. He saw the poverty and squalor in Britain's great cities and believed it was a stain on the glory of the empire. But the defining issue that would drive a wedge between him and his party was something called tariff reform, championed by the great politician Joseph Chamberlain. It was a proposal to abandon Britain's long-held policy of free trade and create a system of protective tariffs. To Churchill, this was a betrayal of a core principle of economic freedom, a policy that would make food more expensive for the poorest people. He fought it with all his energy. But he was in a minority. He found himself increasingly isolated. So, in May 1904, in one of the most dramatic moments in modern British politics, Winston Churchill did the unthinkable. He crossed the floor of the House of Commons. He literally walked from the Conservative benches to sit with the opposition Liberal Party. To his former colleagues, he was now a traitor, a rat. He was ostracized socially. For a man from his background, this was a brutal punishment. But Churchill was gambling, as he always did, that he was on the right side of history. And he was right. In 1906, the Liberals won a landslide election, and Churchill, at the age of 31, became a minister in the government. For the next decade, he was at the heart of power, a whirlwind of energy. As a reforming Home Secretary and later as First Lord of the Admiralty, in charge of the Royal Navy, he was a driving force in the Liberal government's program of social change. He helped lay the foundations of the modern welfare state, introducing unemployment insurance and labor exchanges. He was a champion of the poor, a stance that seemed utterly at odds with his aristocratic upbringing. In 1908, he married the beautiful but penniless Clementine Hosier, a woman of fierce intelligence and unshakable principles who would become his anchor and his most trusted advisor for the rest of his life. She was one of the few people who was never afraid to tell him when he was wrong. As head of the Navy, he prepared Britain for the war with Germany that he, unlike many of his colleagues, saw was coming. He championed new technologies like airplanes and submarines. He made sure the fleet was ready. So when war finally came in August 1914, the Royal Navy was at its battle stations. Winston is back. The signal went out to the fleet when he returned to his old post at the Admiralty on the first day of the Second World War. The same sense of readiness was true in 1914. But the Great War would also bring him his greatest humiliation. As First Lord, he was the chief political architect of the Gallipoli campaign in 1915, a bold plan to knock Turkey out of the war by forcing a fleet through the Dardanelles Strait. It was a strategic gamble that, if it had succeeded, could have shortened the war by years. But it failed. It failed catastrophically. The naval attack was repulsed, and the subsequent land invasion of the Gallipoli Peninsula became a bloody stalemate. Churchill was blamed. He was made the scapegoat for the disaster and was forced to resign from the Admiralty. At the age of 40, his career was in ruins. He was a fallen man. But what does a man like Churchill do when he is cast out? He goes back to the fight. He took a commission as a lieutenant colonel and went to command a battalion in the trenches of the Western Front. For 6 months, he shared the mud, the danger, and the misery of the ordinary soldiers. It was an act of redemption. He was eventually brought back into government, but the stain of the Dardanelles followed him. The end of the war saw him as a senior minister, but the political landscape had changed. The 1920s were a turbulent time for him. He rejoined the Conservative Party, even serving as Chancellor of the Exchequer, the same job his father had thrown away. But he never felt truly at home. He was always something of an outsider, a maverick. And then, In 1929, he lost his seat in Parliament. For the next 10 years, he was out of power. This was his time in the wilderness. He was a voice crying out, but a voice few wanted to hear. From his home at Chartwell in Kent, he wrote books, he painted, and he watched with growing alarm the rise of a new and terrible threat in Germany. He had met Adolf Hitler briefly in Munich in 1932, and he was not impressed. But he read Hitler's book, Mein Kampf, and he understood, as few others did, the true nature of the Nazi regime. He saw the ruthless ambition, the racial hatred, and the insatiable lust for conquest. And he began to warn the world. Year after year, in Parliament, in newspaper articles, in speeches, he sounded the alarm. He pleaded for Britain to rearm, to build up its air force, to stand firm against Hitler's aggression. But Britain, weary of war, wanted peace. The government, led first by Stanley Baldwin and then by Neville Chamberlain, pursued a policy of appeasement. They believed that by making concessions to Hitler, they could avoid another catastrophic war. Churchill was dismissed as a warmonger, a relic of a bygone age. His own party distrusted him. He was a lonely, isolated figure. But he never stopped. He was sustained by his own certainty, by the information smuggled to him by a secret network of civil servants and military officers who shared his fears, and by his deep study of history. He knew that weakness invited aggression, that to yield to a bully only makes him demand more. The climax of this period came in September 1938 with the Munich Agreement, when Britain and France agreed to allow Hitler to dismember Czechoslovakia. Chamberlain returned to London proclaiming peace for our time. The nation rejoiced. But Churchill, in a speech to a hostile House of Commons, delivered a verdict that is echoed through history: you were given the choice between war and dishonor. You chose dishonor, and you will have war. He was, of course, proven right. In March 1939, Hitler seized the rest of Czechoslovakia. In September, he invaded Poland, and Britain finally declared war. On that first day of the war, Churchill was brought back into the government as First Lord of the Admiralty. The signal flashed to the fleet: Winston is back. For the next 8 months, during the strange, quiet period known as the Phony War, he was the most energetic and aggressive minister in a government that still seemed half-hearted. Then, in May 1940, Hitler unleashed his blitzkrieg on Western Europe. As Norway, Denmark, Holland, and Belgium fell, and the French army crumbled, the House of Commons finally turned on Neville Chamberlain. In the ensuing political crisis, there was only one man who could command the confidence of the nation. On May 10, 1940, Winston Churchill, the man who had been ridiculed, distrusted, and cast out, became Prime Minister. He was 65 years old. The German army was at the Channel coast. The British army was trapped at Dunkirk. Invasion seemed imminent. It was the darkest hour in Britain's history. But for Churchill, it was the moment his whole life had been a preparation for. He was, at last, walking with destiny. Commentary. So what do we take from this incredible story? What are the lessons from a life lived on such an epic scale? The first, and perhaps most powerful, is the idea of preparation. Churchill's life before 1940 seems like a series of disconnected episodes: soldier, journalist, politician, painter, historian, outcast. But Andrew Roberts shows us that it was all connected. Every adventure, every failure, every book he read, every speech he gave, was a piece of the puzzle. His time in the wilderness wasn't a diversion from his destiny, it was an essential part of it. It gave him the knowledge, the perspective, and the lonely courage to be right when almost everyone else was wrong. It's a profound reminder that the experiences that seem like setbacks or detours in our own lives might just be the very things that are preparing us for our greatest challenges. The second lesson is about self-belief. Churchill's conviction in his own destiny was extraordinary. It bordered on arrogance, and it made him many enemies. But it was also the engine that drove him. It allowed him to endure decades of criticism and failure without ever losing faith in himself. He teaches us that while humility is a virtue, there are moments when an unshakable belief in your own abilities is the only thing that will carry you through. It's not about being blind to your faults, but about knowing your strengths so deeply that the doubts of others cannot touch you. Finally, Churchill's life is a testament to the power of resilience. He was knocked down again and again. Gallipoli, the political wilderness, the endless mockery, any one of these could have broken a lesser man. But Churchill had what he called an unbreakable spirit. He treated triumph and disaster, in Kipling's words, as two impostors just the same. He learned from his mistakes, but he never let them define him. He always got back up and re-entered the fight. So, how can you apply this to your life today? First, become a student of your own life. Look at your experiences, your successes and your failures, not as random events, but as part of your preparation. What are they teaching you? What skills are you building, even when you don't realize it? Second, cultivate your own inner conviction. What is the one thing you believe you are uniquely suited to do? Nurture that belief. Feed it with knowledge, with practice, with courage. Don't wait for the world to validate you. Validate yourself. And third, embrace resilience. Understand that you will face setbacks. You will be misunderstood. You will fail. The question isn't whether you will get knocked down, but whether you will get back up. That was the book summary of Churchill, Walking with Destiny by Andrew Roberts. We've touched on the grand sweep of this incredible life today, but a summary is like looking at a map of a great mountain range. The real experience, the real wisdom, comes from climbing the mountains yourself. If any part of this story has sparked something in you, if you felt a connection to this man's struggles and his triumphs, then I truly encourage you to get a copy of this book. Reading it isn't just an act of learning, it's an encounter with a spirit that can genuinely change the way you see your own potential and the possibilities of your own life. You can find a link to the book in the description below. Also, if you found this summary valuable, please show your support by hitting that like button and subscribing to the channel. That way, you won't miss our next journey into another life-changing book from the billionaire's bookshelf. Let's keep learning, and let's keep growing, together.